Hello, Stuart Derek.
Hi, Peter. This is Michael Vera with Late Night in the Midlands. How are you tonight?
Good, good. How are you?
I am doing just fine, and I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Well, hey, we're live, and I thought maybe we could start out a little bit with your background and how you got involved and interested in all this.
Well, Edgar Cayce talks about how you pick your parents. And so if I indeed picked my parents, my parents were, they both were interested in metaphysics. And it was largely my great-grandmother, my mother's grandmother, she lived to be 107. And so she was about 100 when I was born. And she was a medium. And so I remember going to visit, and I'd go to sit down, and she'd say, "Oh, Peter, your Uncle Herman is sitting there." And I couldn't see anybody. And I just got curious about, what she could see that I couldn't see, and whether, she was the first adult I ever met that had imaginary friends, or I didn't know what exactly. So that created an interest in metaphysics, and I just read everything I could until I got to college. I learned about Edgar Cayce and eventually pursued it further later in my life, where I read There Is a River, his biography, and made my way to the Cayce Center of A.R.E. Here in Virginia Beach.
And
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and this foundation, this was actually founded by Edgar Cayce himself. Yes. He had a hospital here from 1928 to 1930, and then a year later he founded the Association for Research and Enlightenment. That's fantastic. He was, I don't have to tell you, but I mean, what an incredible human being he was, and I'm looking forward to learning more about him. You can never know enough, and this is something that never gets old as far as topic goes. So he built the center. Was it 1931 that he put it together? Well, he moved here to Virginia Beach in the mid-20s, and then he opened a hospital from 1928 to 1930. And then when the hospital closed, his next step was this organization, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, which has been around since 1931. Oh, fantastic. So now, and he was born in Kentucky, and his psychic abilities would begin and appear when? I mean, I guess let's just start out with Edgar Cayce a bit here, and let's learn about who he was and when all this started to occur for him. And I mean, he was psychically gifted his whole life. So as a child, he talked about how when he would go on walks as a kid, he could see all the nature spirits, and I guess they call them the elementals, and I guess that's what leprechauns are from, traditionally. But he could see all these basically sprites and elves and nature spirits, and then he also had contact with kind of angelic beings, or the angelic realm, and he could communicate with. He said the trees used to greet him as a child, and then as he got older, he started noticing he could see people that other people couldn't see. So he saw like what he later called discarnates. And then he was always very telepathic. He could pick up people's thoughts, and he could also see the color patterns around people, which are now called the aura. So these are all he lived in a very kind of alternative world, which was hard for him as growing up, because he's just in rural Kentucky, and his nickname was the Freak, just because he was always talking to. It looked like he was talking to himself, and when asked, he would describe these people that nobody else could see. So a little bit rough on him. And then when he was a teenager, he moved to, he left Hopkinsville, where he was living. He moved to the next largest town, Bowling Green, and he got a job at a bookstore. And he had developed the ability to sleep on a book,
and retain the photographic memory of its contents. And so he slept on the catalog of the bookstore, and when he interviewed, he knew all the books they carried, and then he later knew where all the books were stocked. And so before computers, that was quite a skill to have. And eventually lost his voice, and that became the start of the next chapter of his life.
I see. So, yeah, I was going to ask about that, his ability to sleep on a book, I guess put it under his pillow or something, and that he would be able to memorize it?
Yes, that happened when his father, he was never a very good student, and so he had problems with spelling, and so his father was working with him on spelling, and it was getting late, and his father was getting angrier with him, and so he asked his dad if he could just rest a bit because he was tired, and he fell asleep on the book. And when he woke up, he had a photographic recollection of every page, every word. And then his father, who was quite a character, would always brag about anything he could, and so this got around, and a state senator. Actually, he talked to a senator, and Edgar Cayce, a boy of about 9, slept on the senator's speech and delivered the whole speech to the senator and the staff, and that made the newspaper. So that's a verified story.
Yeah, now that's fascinating. Now the legend has it, as I was actually reading up today, and what I seen on your site was that he was able to see and speak with his late grandfather spirit, is what it said there, and that he often played with imaginary friends who he would explain to be spirits from the other side. Now how young was he when this began? I mean, this was as a child?
Well, the first like documented case of him actually knowing that somebody was deceased was with his grandfather. He was very close to his grandfather, and his grandfather died in a horseback riding accident. And in Kentucky, when a man dies, all the males of the family are present as they prepare the body for burial. So little Edgar was there. He knew that he had seen his grandfather prepared for death and buried. But then a few days later, he saw his grandfather out behind the barn. So he knew that this was unusual, that this was somebody who he had seen dead and buried, and then he saw him, and then he went to tell his mother, and she just told him, she said, "Oh, you must have second sight." So she didn't demonize it. She didn't, tell him it was to stop doing that. And so for the rest of his life, he had really a ministry with people on the other side. He talked a lot about how birth into this world is parallel to what we experience at death. It's like you transition into this dimension. And then he said that just like with birth, most births are uncomplicated, and maybe 1 out of 1,000, requires medical intervention or something like that. He said death is the same way. He says that most death is simple, but he said sometimes it's more complicated. And he and folks on the other side would help people that were having a difficult time transitioning.
I see. So then, that's interesting. So because that's what I've often thought is that, when we die, maybe we're actually really being born and and then when we're born, maybe we're actually really dying somewhere else. Yeah. So that's fascinating.
Yeah. And then he he gave a lot of talks. He was a public person. And he said sometimes these discarnates would come to his talks. Like if you ever give a talk and you notice lots of empty seats, there may be discarnates, that are not, souls that aren't in a body. And he said sometimes they would even raise their hands, like ask a question. And so he would every now and then entertain a question from a discarnate that was in the audience.
That's incredible. I had a friend who had recently passed away here, and she was a psychic. And I wonder now that if a psychic like Edgar Cayce, for instance, goes to the other side, is he now helping people on the other side connect with us on this side? You mean
is he like kind of like a medium, like helping?
Yeah, exactly. Like, would he be helping people on the other side now connect with, like, you and I, say, on this side?
I mean, that's possible. I haven't heard of that, but that's, you know, he was certainly on this side. He was helping people make the transition. So, kind of what his role on the other side is, I'm not. Wouldn't be sure.
So what did Edgar Cayce? Where was his position on death? I mean, like, we'll go to the hospital and we'll visit people, and they're on their deathbed. And it seems like they're in agony for a few days. Well, did he ever discuss that? Like, does the spirit leave the body before any of that, or how does all that happen? Do you know?
Well, talking just about Edgar Cayce's perspective. Well, he didn't go into, whether, when exactly the soul leaves the body. I mean, one of the reasons he said that he had learned how to give readings, basically when he would give a reading, his soul or whatever, would leave his body and stay connected with a silver cord that connected just below his navel. And he said that, he says we all do that every night when we sleep, where our soul leaves our body, and we have kind of different dimensions of consciousness that we have experiences in. And so he said that. Just remind me your question again.
Well, I was wondering if what he had to say about death, as far as like when we might leave the body. As when we're in the hospital. And we're looking at, say, mom or dad, and they're in that bed in agony for a few days or out of it. Is that soul still in that body? I guess would be a big question.
I remember where I was going with that. He talked about in a previous life that he had been mortally wounded in a battle, and it took him 3 days to die. And he said that's when he learned how to leave his body. That it was basically the pain taught him basically how to disconnect from the pain and rise out of the body, and then wait for the physical death. And then the silver cord was cut, and then he crossed over. But since he had learned to do that in that life, that helped him leave the body when he was Edgar Cayce. So it certainly would lie to reason that if we're in pain, that we could certainly leave the body while we're still alive, but the soul has separated, or not quite in the body, not quite feeling pain the way we might.
Right. So basically, the machines are keeping the body alive, not the soul, because the soul has, if you want to leave, you could probably leave.
Yes, you can learn how to separate from the body consciously. He says we all do it unconsciously when we sleep. But some people learn how to disconnect from the body in consciousness, and certainly pain becomes a motivator to do that. Because in psychology they just talk about like dissociation, where somebody's going through a traumatic experience, they learn how to leave the body, and so they kind of observe it from another place, like it's happening to something they're watching from a distance. You hear that with trauma survivors, that sometimes they have learned how to dissociate.
Yeah, well, I know in my own case, years ago, I almost drowned in the lake. I mean, I got to a point where I knew I wasn't going to make it to shore, and I knew I wasn't going to last. And you get to a point where you're at peace. At least I did, where I was at peace, and I knew I was going to sink, and I knew it was over, and I accepted it. And and it was very peaceful. I didn't struggle. I didn't go nuts, and my friends saved me. But I was ready.
Yeah. So, yeah, interesting.
It is. It's strange. So I guess growing up, people probably looked at Edgar Cayce as a very strange individual. I mean, it wasn't too long before that they were burning people at the stake for being witches. So, him being able to talk to the other side, I'm sure there were some people who were really uneasy about that.
Yes, and also, strangely enough, he was a very religious boy. And he was very... he read the Bible all the time, and so he was always questioning his abilities. His mother knew that he was a good person and that he would never use anything of these abilities wrongfully. But when he learned how to go into trance, and give readings, he was very suspicious of handing himself over to somebody else's control. And he made promises. He made 2 promises, that if he ever gave a reading that hurt somebody, he'd stop. And if he ever gave a reading that went against his Christian beliefs, he would stop. And he never gave a reading that hurt anybody, but when reincarnation started coming up as a theme in his readings, he stopped for a while because he wasn't sure how to reconcile his Christian Bible beliefs with the doctrine of reincarnation.
So okay, so he I mean, he knew the Bible in and out. I'm sure he slept on it and he memorized it.
He made a promise as a child to read it one time for each year of his life. So
and he did
it. They said the only thing you ever saw Edgar Cayce holding was the Bible or the newspaper, or ever reading.
So then I would have to seriously assume that he believed, at least in most of what was in that book, right?
Oh yeah, he sure did. He was a very active Sunday school teacher.
Incredible. And I mean, and here's a guy who was really gifted. I mean, I have no doubts. I have no questions on whether Edgar Cayce was really able to do the things that it said that he did, because I absolutely have no doubts of that. So now I believe he put out a book about the Bible, didn't he? And what kind of things did he have to say? I mean, was he able to connect back, like in the time of Jesus and things like that? I mean, did he ever?
Oh yeah, he did. He he was so interested in the Bible and all the characters of the Bible. He gave lots of readings about Jesus and the Bible, and one thing, it's quite clear that when he was talking about God, he was quite clear that God is the God of all people, and that religions are just kind of the way that we try to touch God. That God is bigger than any religion. So he was personally Christian, but at one point, let's say, like, they asked the question, "What's the best religion?" and the answer that came back through him was the one that you'll practice. So I always like to share that the whole New Age movement is really about how God is bigger than any of the religion, and so he certainly came to believe that, and and basically taught that. He's known as a father of holistic medicine, but I don't think he's known as well for being a father or a forerunner of holistic theology, because his readings reconcile a lot of Eastern religious doctrines with Western and Christian, Judeo-Christian traditions. He was very comfortable with Jesus, but he also talked about Buddha and Lao Tzu. Very comfortable with prayer, but he talked a lot about meditation. And then he brought in the concept of reincarnation. And basically, as a Christian, he had to reconcile with reincarnation. And as I have, that's one of the things that brought me to him, was that I was always a kind of student of different religious traditions, and I really did. It never resonated with me to think that any of them were any better than any other. And certainly, I was raised Catholic, and I never liked this thought that no one gets to God but through Jesus. And Cayce interpreted that in a very open way, meaning that he talks about Jesus being the man, but this Christ is a consciousness. And he says that consciousness is in all of us. And when Jesus was saying, "No one gets to the Father but through me," he meant no one gets to the Father, or no one gets to God except through this Christ consciousness, which really the consciousness has nothing to do with a religion. It's about, he said, the Christ consciousness is a pattern that is imprinted in the mind, and it's awaiting to be awakened by the will of our soul's oneness with God. And that's the essence of what we call Christ consciousness, meaning that we awaken that we're all one. That you and me and the earth and God, we're all one. And we need to act as if we're a family. And that's the Christ consciousness, when we're acting like we're all members of a loving family.
Wow, he was such a brilliant man, because I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think that
it's hard to disagree.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've always said that. It's like, no matter how you get there, everybody might have different roads that they take to get there, but we're all going to the same place. And and I always believe that God energy, that Christ consciousness is within us. and that, you know, we're all able, we don't need middlemen. We can all connect ourselves if we just get out of our cloud, right?
Yeah, exactly. There was a conservative religious group that approached the A.R.E. to make a documentary, and Charles Thomas Cayce, Edgar Cayce's grandson, who was running the A.R.E. at that time, he, you know, was cautious but invited a dialogue. And during the dialogue, the separating point was that this group wanted to have final say over how the A.R.E. was portrayed in the documentary, and the A.R.E. did not wanted to have final say themselves. And Charles Thomas and the A.R.E. was skeptical because this group had been very critical of the A.R.E. in the past. And so once it became clear that the A.R.E. was not going to participate in this documentary, the people from this group, they let down their hair. You know, they showed their teeth, and they basically said, "Do you know why we hate you people?" Or, you know, not hate, I think they said, "Do you know why we dislike you people?" And the fellow that was, you know, when Charles Thomas was telling the story, he's like wondering, like, gosh, you know, we know they've always disliked us. What is it? Is it that because we're soft on sin, or we believe in reincarnation? You know, finally we get to understand why they dislike us. And it said, "We dislike you people because you dare to teach that everyone has access to God. How dare you teach that?" And, you know, Charles Thomas said he was kind of shocked. And, you know, basically, if there's a reason to dislike the A.R.E. or dislike Edgar Cayce or the New Age, that's a good reason, because that's indeed what, you know, came through Edgar Cayce.
Well,
we all have access to God. You don't need to go through, you know, one of the franchises.
And that's one of the things I noticed big time, Peter, is that people who are highly religious, and I mean in a sense where they've been pretty much programmed by whatever belief it is, a lot of them will say, you know, like I had some people around me not long ago who so you can't have psychics, no psychics, that's against God, that's against the Bible. And I'm thinking, that's a gift from God. Are you kidding me? I mean,
I know, and the Bible is full of like psychics and seers and, you know, dream interpreters.
Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, I can see how, and again, I mean, some of these people, if they were in charge, some of us would still be getting burnt at the stake. You know,
exactly. Yeah. You know, I do. One of the things I do at the A.R.E., I'm a licensed clinical social worker. So I'm a psychotherapist with one hat, and then I also do hypnotherapy and past life regression with the other hat. And one of the most often common kind of past lives that I see from people in the New Age is that they were killed at the stake, or they were punished for having intuitive or psychic abilities, and in this life they have a fear of expressing it. And so that's part of that we all kind of get more comfortable with having these gifts, and it's a much safer time now to realize those.
Yeah, well, I agree, and I think that it's I don't know if it's that more people are being gifted or if it's just more people are talking about it now. But you know, there are a large percentage of people who you know, I know some of them are limited. I mean, some can't tap right into it, but there are people who, I mean, this is why I think it's fascinating. I mean, there are people who could really connect with the other side. They could do these things, and for somebody who's never experienced any of this, they're thinking, come on, this has got to be crazy. I mean, come on, why can't I do it? Well, you know, we all can. You know, I've had connections with the other side, but I had no control over it. It just happened.
Well, yeah, Cayce said anybody could do that. You know, anyone can do what he did. He says you just have to be able to put the ego aside. And, you know, I always say, gosh, you know, my ego's the size of Cleveland, trying to move that thing.
Yeah, you know, me too. That's one of my issues. But, you know, and you want it to happen now. But, you know, there's people who can control it. And, I mean, they must be on a whole nother level. They must, I mean, what did he explain? Like when he was connecting with the other side, I know he'd get in like a state of relaxation and meditation, and I mean, where would he go? Would he explain? Did he go to another time, another space? Well, what was happening?
Yeah, he was asked that question, and he said that when he was doing a health reading, so let's say if you got a health reading from Edgar Cayce, you'd go in the trance state, and then he would be able to tune into your body. I mean, you should see these readings. They're like a doctor. He would go through like your heart rate. You know, he would give the counts, the numbers of what was going on in the different aspects of your body. He'd go through all the systems and scan that. And what he said he was doing is that he was going through his unconscious mind and accessing your unconscious mind. And he says each of our unconscious mind has all of that information stored in it. Like our unconscious mind is completely in tune with our physical well-being. But he was able to go, through his unconscious mind to the place of oneness, and then come down and locate, almost like go to a cell phone tower and then hit back into your unconscious mind, and then he could access it. So that's what he did for a physical reading. But when he would do like a life reading, which is the other major type of reading that he would do, like if you wanted to find out, like if you wanted a life reading, he would basically find out, he would tell you about several of your past lives and how they were influencing the life you're in now, and kind of what kind of abilities you have, maybe what kind of caution you about certain habits that you may fall victim to in this life, and kind of what things to avoid. And he said he got that from reading something called the Akashic Records. He said there's this, Akasha is like an ether. And he says that every moment in time gets recorded on this ether. And he says that he was able to read that. And he visualized it by, he said he saw himself going to an ancient library. And he'd walk up these big steps, and a monk would come out with this large book, and then they would open the book, and that would be your life, your past lives, and then he would read that. And so they said, wow, really? It's this big library? And then the source said, no, it's not. That's just the way that Edgar Cayce imagines it. It's not like that at all. It's almost like the Akashic Record exists in this kind of plane where it's not visual, but he had to download it in a understandable form, and that was the form that his imagination took to have it appear.
I see. So now, knowing this, and I'm sure that he's proved it over and over again, right? I mean, he probably hit the nail right on the head too many times to call it coincidence.
Oh yeah, I mean his, the people that got the life readings, were very impressed because not only would he talk about the past, but he would talk about the present life, like the influences that it had on the current life, and about kind of the tendencies that a person had, and they would tune into that. Like an example, I just gave a tour to some people from the reporters at the A.R.E, and we have a beautiful meditation room at the center, and it has this beautiful stained glass in it. And the stained glass was donated in 1975 by a woman named Frederica Fields. And her story was that when she was a young woman of like 22 years old, she was getting married, and her mother was, knew about Edgar Cayce, and so her mother thought of getting her daughter a really neat wedding present, and so she asked Edgar Cayce if he would give her a life reading, and so he did, and they recorded it, and so she gifted that to her, to her daughter. But her daughter was, 22. And she says, oh, my God, another weird gift from, my freaky mother. And so she put it aside. And she didn't read it for like 45 years. So she's retired. She's going through her attic, and she finds this, like, oh, my God, this is what my mother gave me when I got married. I never looked at it. And so she read it, and it was about her past lives, and it said that she had artistic past lives, and that in this life, if she were to get involved with a stained glass, she would achieve fame, national kind of identity with stained glass. And she nearly fell down because she had retired as a stained glass artist, and she has a window hanging in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And so she contacted the A.R.E, and she donated the beautiful stained glass that we have. that was an example of, you know, how he had hit it. You know, and she hadn't even read it to have that influence her. She read it after she had already retired from her career. You know, she said that she had, you know, after she got married, she went to, you know, she was studying art. She was in Italy. She started learning about stained glass. She really loved it and proceeded with that, just as he had predicted would happen.
That is fascinating. I mean, and it's got to be even that much more special because, I mean, as a kid, if you told me, or even, you know, 20 years old, and you told me, hey, here, I got you a reading from Edgar Cayce, I'd probably think the same thing. I'd be like, you know, right. Who is that? What do I care? And now, you know, doing what I do now and knowing what I know now, I mean, to open something like that, it would be like a treasure. And to see that it was right.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had the opportunity to meet many people who knew Edgar Cayce and had readings from him. And all the people are very credible. You know, it's just people from everyday walks of life and, you know, who just were touched by the man and whose readings helped them. You know, sometimes he would give readings for, you know, minor ailments, and they would use, you know, his kind of unusual treatments, and they would get well, all the way to, you know, to major illnesses that he would help at least alleviate.
So he's actually cured, or at least told people how to cure. I mean, did he tell people how to cure disease, or did he actually get in there and do it? No, he didn't. He didn't do it. No, he was not a healer in that way. He was just now modern terms he would be called in that aspect of him would be as a medical intuitive and diagnostician. And so but also prescribe the treatments, which is, you know, he wouldn't just tell you what was wrong with you. He would then prescribe whatever, you know, unusual treatments that would restore you to health. But he's considered a forerunner or father of holistic medicine, because after he finished with the body, he went into your mind, and he would be aware. He would say a big part of your illness is that you're very pessimistic, or you have an anger problem, or, you know, you're dwelling on all this, you know, grudges and anger and jealousy. He says, you know, that all influences the physical body. So you talk about the body, he would talk about the mind, and then he would talk about the person's spiritual life. You know, their you know, what they were doing with that aspect. You know, were they hopeful? Did they feel that they were connected to something larger than themselves? You know, all these important attributes. So he saw that a healthy person has to have a healthy spiritual life, a healthy mental life, and a healthy physical life. In the reading, I mean, the quote that he's most famous for is he calls, "Spirit is the life, mind is the builder, and the physical is the result." You know, a guy like that, you'd wonder if, I guess that if there was a way to just come back anytime you want, you know, and say, hey guys, guess what it's like over here, he'd be the guy to do it, wouldn't he?
You mean to go and visit him back in those times and have a reading?
Well, no, I mean, like, right now, if he wanted to, I mean, I guess, has he ever contacted anybody from the other side now? I mean, from A.R.E.? I mean, is there any stories about him coming back to say, hey, guys, guess where I am?
It's hard to, they're almost daily, you know, so it's been hard for the A.R.E. to kind of discern. They have apparently some kind of a family, I guess he knew that would happen. And so he and his son devised a certain number of questions that only he would be able to answer from the other side. And the last I'd heard is that all of these people that have said they're Edgar Cayce or channeling Edgar Cayce, they have not been able to answer those questions.
Okay, well, there you hear it, everybody. If any of you out there going to channel and contact Edgar Cayce, you've got to come up with the right answers. So, and I won't know if you did or not. You'll have to contact these guys over at A.R.E. Well, tell us a little bit about A.R.E. and what it's all about, what it represents today, what you do there.
It's you know, Edgar Cayce, you know, he was giving these treatments for very sick people. And it was hard for them to get the treatments administered. You know, he wasn't just prescribing treatments that you could go to a doctor and get. There were a lot of, you know, just like with religion, how he he consulted different traditions. He consulted different medical traditions. So it wasn't all just traditional medicine. A lot of it was alternative and stuff that he created. I talked about certain healing aspects of arcs that were from Native American traditions. And so his dream was to have a hospital where people could come together and get the treatments. But he had given readings to these two stockbrokers, and it actually helped them make money. So they helped him build the hospital here in Virginia Beach. But the Great Depression hit, and other factors led to the hospital having to close in 1930. And then in 1931, they wrote the membership, and they said, what should we do next? The hospital is now defunct. And they wanted to have an organization where they could, meet each other. This is 1931, United States, and people are starting to, whisper about reincarnation and Kundalini and Akashic records. And you couldn't just go to the bookstore and buy a book on this stuff. You probably were worried about, getting stoned if you talked about it, in the wrong places. And so they wanted to meet each other. And so the organization basically organized an annual meeting of the membership, and then Edgar Cayce would give a reading for the group. And so that became what's called Congress, and it continues to this day. Every year, the A.R.E. organizes this meeting for all the members to, whoever wants to come and hear about what the A.R.E. is doing and kind of get lectures about his different subjects and that sort of thing. So the organization basically started to connect people, and then it grew into becoming, after he passed away in 1945, his eldest son took over, Hugh Lynn Cayce, and then they started publishing books, which began to increase the interest in the membership. And so at that time, there were about 100,000 members of the organization. And so they had books, and then they started organizing conferences, which we still have 2 publishing houses. We still have about 2 conferences a month, and we also send speakers out around the country to give talks on Edgar Cayce subjects. And there's now branches of the organization, privately run, but connected with the Edgar Cayce Center or A.R.E. Around the country and around the world. And then at the organization, we have a visitor center, and we have free daily activities to introduce people to the life and work of Mr. Cayce. We have one of the largest metaphysical libraries in the world here in Virginia Beach. We also have Mr. Cayce. His readings and his life as a Christian was very much in not just talking about things, but actually doing helpful things. And so he, as a man, was very involved with prisoners, and he wrote letters, and he was involved with helping prisoners once they got out of jail to resettle into communities. And so the A.R.E. continues that tradition of providing books and memberships to prisoners. And we have some kind of celebrities or well-known people that have been involved with the A.R.E. And our dear Willie Nelson, the singer, he largely funds or is a major contributor to the prison outreach program. He has a place in his heart for them. So that's a nice collaboration we have with Willie.
Yeah,
and
Willie Nelson, he does a lot, and some people look, he smokes pot, so he's some evil guy. See, here's a guy that smokes pot, and look what he does. He does nothing but help people. Just thought I'd throw it out there. He's a big fan of Edgar Cayce, and he really believes that the spiritual message in there can really help a lot of people, and that it's not dogma, and it's not nothing you're going to get beaten over the head with, and so he just helps us with outreach to prisoners. And then the organization, it's membership-based, and so we have a magazine that we publish 4 times a year that goes out to our membership. And we have an affiliated university. It's called Atlantic University, and it's a degree offers degrees in transpersonal studies, kind of metaphysical sciences. And we also have a massage school on the premises. Nice.
So those are some of the things. Oh, I should also, one of the things I do is we also have spiritually based tour program where Edgar Cayce gave a lot of readings about Egypt, so the A.R.E. started taking people to Egypt and studying the readings about what he talked about in Egypt. And so I used to be part of taking tours to Egypt until until the regime fell and it got too dangerous to go there. But next week I'm taking a group to Spain and Morocco, and we do spiritually based travel. So we go to these different parts of the world and talk about what Edgar Cayce had to say about these places, and then we pick up the vibration, go to the spiritual centers, and like in Morocco we're going to be learning about Sufism, and so that's a lot of fun. Like earlier, this year tour went to Cuba. There's another one later in the year going to China and Tibet, and then one going to New Mexico and Chaco Canyon and those places. So we do about 4 spiritually based tours a year.
Well, Peter, I'd absolutely, we got to take a break here in a moment, but I would absolutely love for you to stay in touch with me. And when you've got events like this going, or you get back from events like this and you feel like doing a radio show, I'd love to hear all about it.
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to.
All right, great. Well, hang on with us for a moment. Let's take this break, folks. This is Late Night in the Midlands. I'm Michael Vera. My guest is Peter Woodbury.
Which is, the word, if you label it Christ, it makes you think it's connected to Christianity. Right. It was much broader than that. Like, it was just a consciousness that because we're in this physical world, it's in our deeper mind. It's almost like we've kind of forgotten our spiritual reality in this physical dimension, and so we have to awaken this kind of pattern that he says that's in our mind that's awaiting to be awakened, and it's a pattern of oneness, that we are one with our Creator. Our soul is one with its Creator, and that the problems that are caused from Cayce's perspective when we're in this kind of sleeping, awakened state, is that we think of things as separate, and then we get into me and mine and you and yours, and I'm going to put a fence and I'm not going to share. And he says that's an unenlightened consciousness, because it's basically as if your thumb was stealing all the food and all your fingers are starving. It's like it wouldn't make any sense for the thumb to be selfish with the hand, But that's when we're in Earth, we look at the fingers and see them all as separate, whereas they're all one in the hand. And that's his perspective, that if we can awaken that universal consciousness, that in essence we come from oneness. And all the people that we admire, if you look at the great saints and the avatars, they're basically talking about that. They're talking about oneness, that we're all part of a family.
Yeah, and that was an excellent way to put it. You're not the fingers, you're not the thumb, it's the hand, it's the collectiveness. Yeah. I like that. And people need to, it's like people who walk around the early part of their lives and they treat people badly because they think that they're perfect and beautiful and da-da-da. And then later in life, they wind up being a bag of wrinkles and they have pretty much nothing. And then they wonder why nobody bothers with them. Maybe that's karma, I guess.
Yeah, that is karma.
So, now you mentioned the pyramids before the break. Tell me a little bit about what Edgar had to say. Now, didn't he say that there was a compartment in the foot of the Sphinx or something like that, and that there was...
Yeah, buried beneath, I think it's the right paw, the front paw of the Sphinx. He said there was a chamber where this hall of records is kept. And it's these records that there are 3 sets of them that are around the world, and that the Egypt, below the Sphinx is one of the locations. And it's basically a history of our souls, how we came as souls to enter the earth and how we came to inhabit bodies, and basically the different civilizations that we have, we've gone through up until, when the time that those were written, which I think was around, they were buried, I think, around the time of the collapse of Atlantis.
Now, they claim that they've dug and dug and dug around for them and never found anything, but I'm willing to bet that they would have probably found something and then not told us they found it.
Well, it's, we were making a lot of progress. They have found what they used the sound radar, and they found what they call anomalies. It's just like, holes. And then when there was, that Giza Plateau, like right in front of the Sphinx, that used to be where ships would land. Like there used to be water there. Like the Nile used to come right up to the Sphinx. Apparently it was very beautiful, and that's where you would get off of your boat, right in front of the Sphinx. And so there's underground water there, and they were starting to find that the Sphinx was at risk of sinking because of the underground water. So they've done drilling beneath the Sphinx to release the water and figure out, how deep is the water and the damage and that sort of thing. And they have found chambers under there. But, the economy of Egypt is so dependent on, they're very hesitant to start digging where it might collapse a pyramid or collapse the Sphinx or something like that. So it's been just slow going. The former curator of the Giza Plateau, Zahi Hawass, he's very linked with the A.R.E. His part of his education was paid by the A.R.E., and so he had been quite connected with the A.R.E. So when our tours used to go there, we used to get private access to places there. But his politics were very much not aligned with Mubarak, and they've all been thrown out of there.
Yeah. So what did Edgar say as far as the pyramids being built, the Sphinx being built? It's been a major mystery, I guess, and a lot of speculation. I don't know. I think there's two options for me. It was either advanced technology that was created here on Earth that they just aren't telling us about or they don't know about, or it was from otherworldly, because I don't see how they did these things with if all they were working with was stone tools and logs. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, there's there's stones in the Great Pyramid that weigh I don't know how many hundreds of tons. Like there's only 3 cranes in the world that could lift something that heavy, and we're talking that the Great Pyramid, I think it's, I don't know how many stories high, it's like 20 stories high. And so, how they can think that, a bunch of guys are going to hold up something that weighs a couple hundred tons, and they're going to lift it, at this height. And then if you go to the pyramid and you put your hand along the seams, if you close your eyes, you can't feel it. I mean, these stones are placed with perfect precision. I mean, it's awesome. And then the king's chamber, there's a sarcophagus in there. The sarcophagus doesn't fit in the door. So the sarcophagus was there as they built around it. I mean, so the technology of this structure, like we could not build that now. There's no way we could build the Great Pyramid in modern times. I mean, one example is that the entrance to the Great Pyramid is, I think, like 3 or 4 degrees off of being direct north. The Eiffel Tower, which is our modern technology, they tried to make it due north. It's like 12 degrees or 13 degrees off of due north. And so here's something that was built, debatable how many thousands of years ago, but it's still a better, in some ways it's still just completely incredible. I mean, they're any way you can look at the pyramid mathematically, architecturally, spiritually, it's just amazing. And then then Edgar Cayce comes in, and about the pyramid inch. That's you have this. There's this marker in the Great Pyramid that it's about an inch long, and somebody had devised this concept that it measured time. That it was a history of time as you go in through the pyramid, and there's points where there's an opening, and then you go into the king's chamber, and it plots with as you have to walk into the pyramid stooped, and then it opens up, and he affiliated that with the birth of Christ, and that becomes the open period. Then you have to go into the pyramid, and then there's the Great World Wars that are marked in there, and then basically he goes up the side. The person who wrote this, I forget the guy's name, when Edgar Cayce was asked about it, said, "Yeah, he did a great job, except he didn't continue going up." And the date that the pyramid calendar ends at is 2038. Like, one of the functions of the pyramid is it's a calendar that goes until the year 2038.
Now, I thank you for sharing that with me, because I honestly had never heard about that aspect of the pyramid, believe it or not. And some people might say, how the hell did he not know about that? But I didn't. So please, do go on.
Well, we had, my mother was Puerto Rican, and so I speak Spanish. And when with the 2012 was, prophecy, a couple years ago, we had a lot of Mayan conferences to look at that. Well, we had a Mayan elder come, and he spoke Spanish, so I was his interpreter, and I got to hang out with them. This was, his name will come to me. He's written several books. Well, anyway, he came to the A.R.E, and he was talking about the Mayan prophecies, and he says, a lot is made about 2012, and he says, that is they go through cycles that have to do almost like with human age, and he says their cycles go through 13 years, and he says 2012 is the beginning, but the next 13 years and the second 13 years, the first 13 years are like adolescence, that's going to be not too bad, but then 2012, the second period between ages 13 and 26, that's where there's more energetic problems. And he says, so we're more worried about reaching 2038. And I said, when I heard that, I said, well, that's Edgar Cayce says that's with the pyramid. That's the date of that. And he had never heard that either. And so there were these two really neat collaborations that, I was thinking, gosh, the next book that's out there is going to be 2038. I mean, we've written one. The A.R.E has one book on 2038. It hasn't really caught on as the next year of prophecy. But apparently from Edgar Cayce and from the Mayan traditions, that's a year to pay attention to. Basically, if we can get to 2038, we're getting through this hump. That some people think it's the transition point between the Piscean age into the Aquarian age, and Cayce talked about how we've been here before with Lemuria and Atlantis, and now we have another opportunity to kind of transcend as humanity to get past the tendency to be self-centered and selfish, the separate mentality, and move to a more collective mentality.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's pretty fascinating. So it ends in 2038. So now I remember the Mayan calendar and how everybody thought that December 21st, 2012, the world was going to come to an end, when the Mayan calendar really didn't say that at all. But now, in the case of the pyramids, here it ends 2038. So should we take that as it's just they got tired of working on it, or they couldn't?
No, it's not the 2038 is not seen as the end of the world. It's almost seen as a celebration. That's a goal. If we can make it to 2038, then we've gotten through the rough patch. 2012 to 2038 apparently are quite crucial times. The times that we're living in are kind of like the Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. We're living through very interesting times, and if you look at the whole history of humanity on Earth, these are very crucial times. And I think that, he also says, that's why you're here, that's why I'm here, that's why we're all here. He says countless souls would like to be incarnate at this time, but that we're here because we're the best hope to get to that. And we're the best hope to bridge this, with the kind of work that you're doing, bringing the universal consciousness to people's minds, the kind of work that I'm doing at the A.R.E, the kind of work we're all doing in our own little sectors. We're all kind of trying to put our energy towards just kind of lifting the consciousness to make it to that date.
Yeah,
make it to that and beyond.
You're right, and this is very important. And sometimes there's shows that will cover just the horrible news that's going on in the world their entire show. And I cover that stuff maybe in the beginning of the show, and certain shows we will. But this aspect of it is so important too. So there'll be some out there who say, well, what good is talking about this? How is this going to help us stop this or that? We may not be able to stop the evil in the world by knowing these things, maybe not right away, but what we can do is prepare ourselves spiritually for whatever comes. And so this is very important.
Well, I think that, you see, Cayce talked about how this shift now, as we're moving into the Aquarian Age, it's a completely different energy that's working with the world. And it has the Aquarian values of, of love for humankind, realization of the true brotherhood and sisterhood of all humankind. And of course, you look around and you see ISIS, you see this kind of stuff, and you think, oh boy, how could we possibly be any farther from a sense of brother and sisterhood? But the way I've come to see it is that, let's say you rent your house to somebody, and their time has come. They're kind of behind on their rent, and they're not quite being the best tenants. And you've kind of talked to them, and it comes time to evict them. It's just that it's that day. It's over, and you go to evict them. Well, some people before they leave, they're going to try to trash the joint. They trash it, and then eventually they move on. And I think there's some energies on the earth that realize they're getting evicted. It's here. It's moving. You're not going to be able to not deal with this. And so I think some of this stuff is just the farewell party of some of these dark energies.
Hey, that's well put too. So maybe that I've been looking for an answer. I've had guests who have come on who have undoubtedly been harassed and tormented by evil entities, some kind of what they'd call demons, I guess. And I always wondered, well, where does this demonic energy come from? Because I'm always told that it never had a body. It just always was, and it was evil, and it's just an energy. And I'm thinking, well, it had to have come from somewhere. Well, that makes sense. It's all that leftover, it's just, that's what it is then, maybe.
It's like, basically Cayce talks about how, the light has been turned on. And so just imagine in the dark, a lot of things can happen in the dark. You turn on the light, the cockroaches start scrambling, and nothing's really changed except you can see everything now. When it was dark, it just kind of seemed fine. You turn on the light, you're like, whoa, what a mess. Oh my God, look at this. And so I think that's what's kind of happening, like with the internet. We're able to see things that we've never been able to see before. Like, I remember when Zagreb came out, when you were seeing the pictures that came out of what was going on in the prison in Iraq. Is that the first time there have been war atrocities? No, of course not. But is that the first time someone's had a camera that you can slip in on the size of a pen and take pictures? See, that's what's different, is that just the light is on. Like Cayce referenced, like in the Bible, it said, what used to be in secret is now going to be shouted from the rooftop. And so that's why we're seeing what's going on in Wall Street. And I used to talk about like Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, the first president that had indiscrepancies in the White House. What's his name? John Kennedy made Bill Clinton look like a schoolboy, but the press used to cover that stuff up. Not now. Now it's like it's all fit to print and it's all out there. So we're basically seeing. It's not that different than it's ever been before, but we're just seeing it now.
Yeah, and that's another great point that, I guess it said somewhere also that man's voice would be heard through the air and things like that. And, you've got radio waves, you've got all these different things. But the internet, since the internet's come out, if you're, and I don't mean you, but anybody, if you're a fake or a con artist or you're up to no good, at some point that is going to come out and it's going to be public. I mean, so you're right. Yeah, it is like, so perhaps then, I had one guy who come on and said, well, evil can arise from cyberspace. And I thought, well, so can greatness, right? I mean, so are we talking about that fight between good and evil? Might it be a cyber type fight?
Cayce said that the closest energy we have on Earth to the God energy is electricity. I've often thought, electricity, we use electricity for healing. We use it for fantastic things. But you can use electricity to kill somebody, too. It depends on the intention that you use something with. Like the Internet. The Internet can be used for fantastic things, or it can be used for really horrible things. It's almost like, we have free will, and we can shape the energies either in perverted ways or in really healing, constructive ways. That's the wonder of having free will, like the gift of the Creator.
Right, and they're talking now about people living after death in cyberspace. Building these like robots or these programs. I've heard this. They're gonna set up like these virtual malls, and they'll be able to upload your personality, everything about you in there, and pretty much they're working on trying to get your consciousness, however they would ever do that, and upload it into this character. So you'd be in this mall for eternity, but you wouldn't know you were there for eternity.
Oh, that's talk about identity theft.
Yeah, I mean, and I think about that sometimes as maybe Edgar Cayce touched on this, but some people say that could be the case, that maybe we're all just a program here right now, and we better hope that whoever's at the computer don't fall asleep, or has he?
Well, he did talk about, one of the things he says is that when we're in a physical body and we get too attached to physical things, that when we leave the body at death, we're still very attached physically. And he calls those, he said that the dimension outside of this dimension, he says the first kind of place we go at, outside of the body, and he says that the souls come in this way and they go out this way, and he calls it a borderlands or an inter-between. But I think of it a little bit like Grand Central Station. It's like people go home that way or they come back, they go to work through this Grand Central Station. But there are some, if you've ever been to Grand Central Station, there's some people that live there. There's some people that aren't transiting. They're setting up residence there. And he says that in that inter-between, there are some souls that have gotten very earthy, very earth attached, and their vibration is such that it takes them a while to transition. And he said that, let's say in the case of addictions, he says let's say if someone is a heavy drug addict, when they die, they maintain that addiction while they're out of a body. And he said if an incarnate person, he says especially if they black out, that discarnate entity can possess the body of the person that's passed out. And so they get like possessed. They have their own consciousness, and then they have this other discarnate entity that's trying to get high through them. And I work a lot with addictions, and to me it's kind of explained why somebody's nice when they're sober, and they struggle so much with addiction, and when they're high or drunk, this completely different like personality comes through. So it almost looks different. So that just a thought that he shared that I remember thinking possession sounded like something from the Catholic Church and demons.
And that goes without saying. I think that you're on to something there. I think Edgar Cayce was definitely on to something there. And that, I back last year in September, I had a heart attack, and after this heart attack, I mean, I could never quit smoking before that, but I had this heart attack, and I gave them up, and I thought, and as time goes on here, I'm thinking, does the soul take these steps to prepare itself for that journey? Like, okay, you're not going to be able to be over here if you're addicted to those, so we'll do a little bit at a time through your life to release these addictions. But then I think of people who don't let go. So how come some can and do, and others do not? And how does that affect you?
Addictions are it's such a hard habit to break. And addiction, it has psychological components, it has physical components, and then now we're seeing it has also spiritual components. And so addictions are like, that's why I think the AA model works well, because it helps people connect to God, with the higher power. And once you start dwelling on the higher power, it's like that repels kind of the lower, if you're dealing with a possession, it starts to repel those energies so that you can kind of start dealing with the addiction just in your own self and try to break that pattern.
Wow.
But I think you're right that you certainly, from Cayce's perspective, you want to try to cross over with as little attachment to things as you can. You know, he says all you take with you is your consciousness. And if you have a loving, kind, generous consciousness, that's going to be like, in a way, you know, when he interprets Scripture, he says, "In my Father's house are many mansions," he says those are states of consciousness. And he says that's what you bring with you. So if you've led a life of kindness and virtue, the mansion that you're going to be in for a while in between lifetimes is that place in consciousness of virtue. But if you've had a lifetime of kind of greed and possession and that sort of thing, that's going to be a state of consciousness that you'll be in for a while as you kind of work through it.
And you know, what worries me about that is, like, where do we draw the line on possession? Like, does that count? Like I'm very attached to my possessions here in the studio because without them I couldn't do what I do. Will that count against me? I mean, am I gonna, you know, is that gonna hurt me on the other side? I hope not, because I'm trying to do good.
No. I mean, it's like, you know, when you go on vacation, you're not, like, missing your equipment, are you? You're not, like, thinking about it.
No, I think about the people I talk to on the show, like you know, we'll be driving.
But that's like, that's not addiction. You know, those are people you care about and you're concerned about. No, that's very high.
Those are relationships, then.
Yeah, that's a, you know, that's a reflection of your consciousness of caring. Like, you'll keep that, you know. One of the things that's quite clear is that love endures. You know, when someone crosses over to the other side, the relationship continues. You know, just because they've left a physical body, we still have a relationship to that soul. And we've probably had a relationship to that soul from the very beginning, you know, like a loved one, a parent, you know, grandparent. Cayce calls that part of your soul group. And so you've been traveling together many, many, many lifetimes. And just because they've died and crossed over, the connection between the two of you remains.
That is fascinating to think about. And now with reincarnation, here's a curiosity that comes out of me with reincarnation. So I had somebody once tell me that, like, I had a visitation from my mom in 2004. So could it be possible that she could visit me and have already reincarnated on top of that? Or
yes,
that is possible.
Yes, because, you know, Cayce kind of was teasing one time. He says, nowadays, he says, people wonder where the soul is in the body. And he's just laughing, like, you know, here we have this little body, and we think the soul is in our body. He says, are you kidding me? The soul is multidimensionally vast. Like, your physical experience right now is like a grain of sand in the totality of what your soul is. You know, he's just thinking, like, your soul is like the pinky of your finger dipped into water, and there's so much more of you. And so he basically says that, you know, after you pass away, that impression remains. You know, like he says, that people can see and experience, you know, Edgar Cayce if they dreamt about him, or even if he was to appear to them. But he could be incarnate. You know, another part of his hand will be in this current life, and his pinky is still, you know. When he talked about time, he got really unusual. Like, he had a dream one time. He was worried about, he was putting all his money and effort, not money, but, you know, his time and effort into the A.R.E., this organization. He wondered if it would ever amount to anything. So he had a dream in the future, like, you know, 2200 or something like that. He said he was living off the coast of Nebraska. Don't get worried there. He said he was living off the coast of Nebraska, and he got into a cigar-shaped vehicle, and he flew and saw that the A.R.E. was still here. And then he went home, and then he woke up from his dream. And then when they interpreted the dream, they said, you know, what is it? Is he dreaming? Could you dream about a future life? And then the answer came back, said, this might be hard to understand, but in Earth you believe in things as past, present, and future. Says time is all one. All your lives are one. So it's like, you're basically saying that, you know, your future life and this life and your past life are all in one time. And that's kind of complex to wrap your head around.
It is, but it's doable. And you know, I don't know, I picture like a bunch of cards in my hand, you know?
Yeah.
and they're all together. Those are all my lives. And You know, some are aces and some are jokers.
Yeah, and I sort of think that if they're all happening simultaneously, somehow they're connected. And so somehow, you know, like what I'm doing in a past life is affecting me now, and what I'm doing in a future life is affecting, you know, somehow it's almost like we're going to achieve enlightenment in these lives at the same time. I mean, it's almost like it makes time seem much more alive. That, you know, it's not static. If they're all one, then it's just like I feel like I'm alive now, but I feel like, oh, if I had a past life, I'm dead. Or if I have a future life, it hasn't happened yet. But if they're all one, it's just fun to think about how they're connected.
Yeah, and for, you know, I'm really curious as to, I'm sure we all are, curious as to what it is like on the other side. I mean, what do people do for fun over there? I mean, is there such thing as fun over there? How does all that work?
He said the bowling alleys on the other side, you would not believe how fun they are. No, I'm kidding. Well, he said that the first dimension we go through is the dimension that we access in dreams. And then he had this, he talked about how our mind, what we believe in, is so important. Like he says, you know, people that don't believe that there's an afterlife and that all you see is all you are. He says when those people die, they get very confused. And he says they feel like they're in a dream, except it's a dream that never ends. He says there's some people that are dead for like 20 or 30 years and they're just kind of wandering around in this dream that doesn't end. And he says that, you know, it takes them a while to kind of orient to like, oh, okay, I guess there is an afterlife. I guess there is something else for me here. But then there's transitions in consciousness, and then Cayce talked about, you know, he says there's an infinite universe of worlds. It's just infinite. And he says we just, you know, a number of us souls came to this earth, and because of the space-time continuum here, we come here to learn patience. Like it's the only place in all of creation where time exists. And since time separates you from things, you know, where time is one, there's no need for patience. It's like, you know, it's immediate. Like thought and results are equal. Where here you can kind of want something and then you don't have it, and then you have to have faith, and you have to have, you know, faith and patience. And so that's the spiritual lesson that we apparently learned here on Earth. But then he says in this, you know, this solar system, he talks of it, it's an 8-level school. Earth is the 3rd dimension. And in between lives, we go to the other schools, which are represented by the planets. So he says the planets are just, like, in between lives, they represent, like, Earth is a planet, but then you can inhabit in consciousness like Mercury. And he says Mercury is all about your mind, and all, you know, just like it is for astrology. And then Mars is all about energy and action. And Venus is all about beauty and love. And he basically says, like, after you've lived a life, and I'll simplify it. So let's say you've been too passive, you've let people push you around, you haven't really stood for yourself. Then you're going to take a sojourn in Mars where you'll pick up energy, like martial energy. And then for your next life, you'll come in with more Mars energy to kind of be more active and kind of pursue your agenda as a soul a little more forcefully. Or let's say you've had a life where you've been too forceful. Then you'll go to Venus and pick up more beauty, harmony, and balance, and you'll add that to your repertoire as a soul.
Oh, so all these planets that we hear about, they actually have more of a purpose than we thought.
Yes, he called it for interplanetary sojourns.
So maybe that's why we could send an Earth-like probe over these things, and they go, no life there. But, you know, in reality, it's just we can't connect on that realm. Ah.
Well, it's on another dimension. Yeah, one thing I've come to understand with Edgar Cayce is that he's real big on consciousness, and it's like, you know, I've always wondered about, like, you know, is God everything, or, you know, what's the difference? Like, how can we experience something that's not God, and then God is basically everything? And the way I've come to understand it, it's like, you know, like radio, like a dial on a radio. There's different frequencies, and you can put your dial to listen to, you know, something horrible, or you can set your dial to listen to something that's really beautiful and peaceful. And that's where the consciousness is. Like, we can all attune to a consciousness of our oneness with God, and we can also attune to like the separateness and the kind of the violence and the greed and that sort of thing. We're just kind of like radios, and we have to kind of, we've had an experience with lowering our vibration to be in the earth, but some of us have forgotten that there's a dial there. We can, that's what meditation does. It's a dial that kind of reminds you that you can shift your consciousness to something where you can go back to your source, back to the oneness. And then, the people that, again, the great saints and avatars have tried to teach that they're trying to live on the earth with the consciousness of oneness. And then, they look amazing. They walk on water, and they're psychic and stuff like that, just because they're attuned to that vibration.
Yeah. So, that's some incredible stuff right there. And, that goes without saying. It's like you look at in space, there's objects out there that if we're not in the right light spectrum, we can't see these things, but they're there.
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Apparently they said that, like in Homer's time, he talked about the sea being red. It's almost like they hadn't picked up yet the vibration of blue. So it leads to believe, maybe there's still colors that we haven't picked up. We're not perceptive into those vibrations yet.
Yeah, very true. Well, hey, we're going to take one more break, and then we're going to have other dimensions which exist on them. So what would so I've always looked at Earth as kind of like a classroom. So am I close? Is that what?
Yeah, that's what he basically, he talked about how, as souls, we have creative ability and free will, like the Creator does. And when we were created, we were given access to the universe of worlds. That's what Cayce called it. And with our creative ability, we create also. So it's like we're like little mini creators, like we're mini versions of the source that we come from. And he talks about how, all of creation, it kind of blows my mind that, you think of this universe of world, like, so many places to go. And our story, you and me and all of our friends, we got interested on Earth. Like, it's this little grain of sand in this universe of worlds, and it drew our attention. It was a physical dimension. We're spiritual, and the soul's androgynous, and there's gender here. So there's a lot of things that were different about the Earth, and we began to project ourselves into the Earth. We began to experience what physicality was like. And then Cayce said we began to spend too long, and it was like staying underwater too long. You'd start growing gills. And so we developed, we lost our spiritual consciousness through going deep into the Earth consciousness. And basically, we're in this process, according to Edgar Cayce, of just trying to remember our spiritual origins. And eventually, it's like this, the prodigal child story, that we were kind of one with the Creator, and then we were given our inheritance, which is, our psychic and spiritual gifts, and we went, yay! And we went all the way out to separateness. And then the story is that we're going to come back to oneness, but we have consciousness of what it's like to not be in oneness. And that gives us like an appreciation, like of that type of consciousness is apparently new in creation. That we'll be able to go back to oneness, and just like the story of the prodigal child, the one that stayed behind is very immature, is jealous and petty, but the one that went through this whole voyage, and suffered and came back, is very mature. This whole journey that we've been on, like you're saying, the school will deepen us. We come back to the Creator with tremendous depth and breadth through everything that we've learned on this soul journey. So it's a little bit, we were one, and then we kind of go into separateness, and we're making our way back to oneness. But sometimes when Edgar Cayce was asked these type of questions, he would say, you're in a three-dimensional world. It's kind of a elemental, basic kind of school. And some of these questions you're asking are way beyond 3 dimensions. You're going into 5, 20, infinite dimensions. He said you won't understand it. It won't make sense in a 3-dimensional mind. So he alluded to to this consciousness here about being very practical. And he warned against getting too much into trying to know too many things without it having any practical application. Because he says that's essentially what we're all here on Earth to do, is to put into practice our spiritual knowledge. And basically, he had a reading where he said, knowledge without practice is an error. Is not. It actually hurts you.
Did he say how many times we come back here for a lesson, or is it that we never graduate? We're always in school. We're always learning.
No. He says that we've come into this dimension, and we're here to learn certain spiritual truths and put them into practice. And once we learn them, he says that different souls have different soul contracts. That like there were those two brothers I mentioned earlier that helped him fund the hospital. One of them, when he got a reading from Edgar Cayce, said, "Oh man, you're almost done. Like looks like it's going to be your last life. You're really are putting into practice all these spiritual truths, and you'll be able to graduate from the school and move on to the the next dimension." And his brother was all excited. He's like, "Oh, let me find out where I am." So he got a reading, and the reading said, "Oh, you made a soul commitment to be, to incarnate until the very end." So the brother wasn't happy to hear that reading.
So, based on Edgar Cayce's, I don't know, would you call him a prophet? Some have called him a prophet. Would you go that far?
Yeah, they're different names. There was one man who came to A.R.E. who understood all the different ways of defining people in kind of biblical terms, and said he would have qualified as a seer. And so his book about Edgar Cayce is called "Seer Out of Season." And so said he was, met the criteria of what a seer is, because most of what he did was his deepest knowledge was accessible to him in an unconscious state.
So based on his predictions, his readings, and all that good stuff, where are we today? I mean, give me some of his predictions that have now are coming true, or even if you got stuff he's predicted that's still to come. I'd love to even get into that a little bit.
Well, he talked about this as being that transition time, and he said the new age, or the Aquarian Age, is going to be marked by it's going to be known as the Age of the Lily, or the Age of Purity, and that's where he's talking about how this Aquarian energy is very, very high vibrational energy, and that basically anything that is not going to have to do with oneness, kindness, kind of high spiritual virtues is going to crumble. And so some of what we're seeing with our economic situation and our government, if you think, are those motivated by high spiritual ideals? Well, if they're not, they're not going to last. Like, they're going to have to be reoriented. They're just there's going to, for them, whatever we're going to build in this new age is going to have to be based on spiritual values. So that was one of the premises that he gave. And then he said we're moving into a time where we're going to be able to communicate with our Creator in our own consciousness, kind of what used to be only these high sages. He says we're all developing that ability to attune to God within our own selves. And so I remember when that book, Conversations with God, came out, I remember thinking that was a little bit arrogant. But then I thought about it. I was like saying, well, he's not saying that I can't have a conversation with God. He's just saying he had one. And so that's what Cayce's talking about. We're all going to enter into, Neil Donald Walsh kind of invited us all to consider, like, gosh, maybe we can have a conversation with God. And that's what Cayce was talking about, that we're going to have that contact. And then he said that there's going to be a development of a real consciousness of oneness. Like, what he says is, like, right now, there can be suffering on the other side of the planet, and we can all sleep fine because we're not connected to that. But he says we're going to develop a consciousness, which, if you talk to people, more and more people are feeling that, like they don't sleep well one night, and then they find out, the next day something has happened, there's been a catastrophe, or they feel kind of bad for a couple of days, and then later on they find out that, a dear one was sick or died around that time. That's the beginning of us starting to all connect to each other. And so the hope of it is that, right now, like I said, there can be something terrible happening on another part of the planet, and we sleep fine. We're going to start being affected more by those sorts of things, and so that's going to make us feel more responsible and more connected to a global consciousness. So those are all the movements that are coming in place. But we're talking about an age that's going to last about 2,500 years, and this is just the beginning of it. So in spiritual time, it's a blink of an eye. But you and I, we're just going to be kind of one little brick in the highway.
Right. Now, I know this question's come up a few times tonight in private chat, but some want to know if Edgar Cayce had visions of oceans rising and climate change to a massive degree, I guess.
Yes, he did. He, Edgar Cayce, like I said, for the most part, he got information directly himself, but there were occasions where he would channel, where somebody else would speak through him, and sometimes it was like the Archangel Michael spoke through him a couple of times. And when he gave the 18 kind of earth change readings, it was given by an angel named Halilio, who someone had told me is the angel or the archangel of karma. And so this angel is the one that gave those 18 earth change readings, and a lot of them haven't quite happened to the degree that was prophesied. So someone did a research project looking on what Halilio predicted and what actually happened, and there were earth changes and earthquakes that happened when Halilio predicted, but they weren't of the magnitude. And Cayce always said that the future in some ways is flexible, meaning that a lot of it depends on consciousness, that there's nothing preordained. And so that sometimes a psychic will predict, well, if things keep going exactly the way they are, this will happen. But if the consciousness of humankind alters, it has a big effect. But some of Halilio did make predictions about, Manhattan suffering earthquakes and the Great Lakes opening up into the sea and Japan falling into the sea. Those were some of the Earth Changes predictions, but times weren't put on them. But Japan is one of the most earthquake centers of our planet. So it's possible that could happen.
Yeah. Wow, that and it really looks like those things are happening. I mean, the oceans have rose, and they're probably going to continue to do that. I mean, the Earth is going through a lot of changes, weather-wise, and so on, and so we're heading to some trying times. And is there a time that the planet, I guess, has to be reset? And then, I don't know, new classrooms are built here or something, or how does that work?
Well, he had, he did have that dream of like 2200, but it was, like I said, he was living off the coast of Nebraska, so I guess the next 200 years are going to have some of those pretty, decimating or earth changes. He did talk about that those things are coming. There are. I think of it in a way like, when there was the tsunami that hit Japan, I think that was to show the world stage that just because we have a cataclysmic event doesn't mean that we have to lose our humanity. What happened in Japan is people continued to act humanely with each other. There was almost like no looting, or there was just a whole lot of sharing. People taking their turns. And so I think that was to put on the global stage that, when can we see that as a model? And so that, when there's something that happens to wherever we are, can we keep our humanity? And that way more people will thrive that way.
Yeah. Now, of course, this question comes up anytime we talk about things like this. People want to know if there was anything mentioned or said, I guess, about a Planet X, a Nibiru, any kind of celestial body coming in dangerous proximity of the Earth?
The only thing, he did talk about the dinosaurs and how he said there were humans at the time of the dinosaurs, and it was alluded to that the dinosaurs had to be eliminated, and it wasn't clear whether that had been with some kind of an asteroid that had hit the Earth, which had wiped them out. And I know that is a theory of how the dinosaurs were killed, but no, he didn't predict anything coming up having to do with that kind of a cataclysm happening with another heavenly body striking the Earth.
Well, that's a good thing then. That's certainly a good thing. Now, what about the medical miracles that he had pulled off? Maybe a couple quick stories about some of the medical, and I know you touched on it earlier, but maybe a little more, because I've been reading a lot about these different medical type miracles, is all they could be called. That he
he cured. His wife had tuberculosis, and he had treatments for her that some of it involved heroin. Heroin was one of the ingredients in some of his treatments for her, and she was cured of tuberculosis at a time where there wasn't a cure. And he was a photographer, and one time his son was playing with the flash powder, and it blew up in his face, and he damaged his eyes. And the doctor said he was going to lose one eye and possibly both. And this was at a time where Edgar Cayce wasn't giving readings because he had been disappointed in some of the people he had worked with. But since his son wanted a reading, he gave the reading, and one of the treatments was to put tannic acid on his eye, which is what you use to soften leather. It was not thought of as having any kind of medical use, but the doctor said, well, he's going to lose the eye anyway, it can't hurt. But to make a long story short, is that his son regained his sight, and both eyes were saved.
Incredible.
So those were some of the, there were just kind of many, basically if somebody applied his treatments, they pretty much got well. He was treating, he had treatments for, cerebral palsy and multiple sclerosis. The treatments still exist today, but with more, I'd say, moderate success. He has an electrical appliance which is to be used for things like Parkinson's, and I've met the people that have felt they've gotten relief, and one woman with multiple sclerosis has had it stopping the progression of it. But I wouldn't say that I've seen of that condition cures, so to speak. But he was more like his perspective on health was that for the most part we get sick because it's not like something outside of us is attacking us, but that our systems, our healthy systems of our body get stagnant. And so his system was really to try to restore your body to its normal balance. And then once in normal balance, it's like miracles can happen. Kind of once you stop, you put down the French fries, and you start sleeping a little bit more, and do these certain. I'm making it simple, but basically, different types of restorative practices. Like he was big on spinal alignment, the electricity that comes out of the spine, using massage to move the lymphatic system, help the lymphatic drainage, and people just with this diet and exercise were a big part of helping lots of people restore to health. But some of the more like miraculous stories are just about things that would happen while he was under trance. Like he one time he was prescribing a treatment, and it involved something called oil of smoke, which was some kind of treatment that they used in the 1920s. And so they couldn't find oil of smoke anywhere. So under trance, they say, where can we get it? He says, Johnson's Apothecary in Cleveland, Ohio. Here's the phone number. Like he had the internet when he was in trance. And so they call the guy up, and he says, oh, yeah, I've got oil of smoke. And he goes and looks for it. He says, oh, my God, I can't find it. I have it in the inventory. I have no idea where it is. So they put Edgar Cayce under trance again. And he says, oh, okay, tell him it's behind the oil of tincture on the third shelf on the left. They called the guy up and said, it's going to sound kind of strange. Can you look on the third, shelf on the left behind the oil of tincture? And the guy said, how'd you know it was there? Like that kind of stuff, that kind of remote viewing.
Yeah.
And then one time he got a reading, a request for a reading from a woman in Sicily. And when he goes into trance, he starts speaking, sounds like Italian. So they go and get the barber. He's Italian. He comes in. He says, "This is dialect. Like this is Sicilian dialect. It's vaguely like Italian." So he wrote down the best he could about what he was trying to prescribe for this woman. So sometimes he spoke in a different language. He could remote view. Like sometimes before a reading, he would make a comment. Like one time he's giving a reading because he could give a reading for anybody anywhere in the world. And so sometimes he, right before giving a guy a reading, he said, "Well, nice red pajamas." And then he went in and gave the reading for the guy. And then they later verified that the guy was wearing red pajamas. And, another time he said, "Oh, the guy's not home yet. He's on the bus. There's been an accident. It's going to take him a few minutes." And so Edgar Cayce went silent. And he said, "Oh, here he is." And, for 15 minutes, "Here he is." And then he proceeded to give the reading once the guy arrived. And these stories were later verified.
And what advice would Edgar Cayce give if somebody was to ask him how to become psychic or how to connect to that realm?
Oh, they did. That was a question that he was asked. And the people that asked him that, they thought they were going to get a simple answer. And it was an 11-year dialogue that became these two books called Search for God. And the long answer to that question was, develop spiritually and let your psychic ability be a result of your spiritual development. And he defined psychic as from the Greek word psyche, meaning of the soul. So he says we're all psychic on our soul level, because the soul comes from the place of oneness, and so everything's one. So whatever somebody else thinks is you can connect with that because you go to that place of oneness. But he says when you do it from a place of spiritual development, that then you're not going to misapply it and use it selfishly. So basically the more you pray, the more you meditate, the more you desire to be helpful to other people, the more you're going to develop psychic ability.
Fascinating. Just absolutely fascinating. Well, I got a few more questions for you here before I give you the floor. And now I understand that still today, people are able to relieve themselves of illness through information that was given in readings, I guess, many, many years ago. Is that true?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like with psoriasis, psoriasis is a treatment that they say there's basically no cure for. And I had psoriasis and worked with his readings. It wasn't easy, but I was able to cure that. And there's a book written by a chiropractor. He's now deceased. It's called Healing Psoriasis, and he's had just tremendous success helping people with psoriasis. Basically, Cayce said that psoriasis is a skin disorder. Like you get this dry skin. It's basically the skin replaces itself every 3 days instead of every 28 days. You get these red patches. It's just kind of unattractive-looking dry patches. Cayce said it was related to my leaky gut, that the toxins were leaking through the intestine back into the bloodstream, and the bloodstream was dumping these toxins out through the skin because it wasn't going out properly through the intestines.
Wow, that's incredible. And now dreams. That question's come up a few times, and we touched on it briefly, but What did Edgar Cayce say about dreams? What are they? Is it another dimension, or is it what science tries to tell us, just neurons going off in the brain?
Well, I remember I did a research paper in college on dreams, and that was a nightmare. I mean, so many different perspectives on dreams. But basically, most of conventional view of dreams is that you're taking events from the day and you're filing them in with your memory. So you're just kind of laying there completely. It's like the shop is closed and some part of you is just doing filing work. It's taking whatever happened in the day and it's kind of putting it in with your memories, and then the dreams are just kind of a pop-up, like, let's say during your day you ate a hamburger, and then it reminds you, dream as you're filing away hamburger, you dream about eating a hamburger when you were 6 years old, and that's how it gets filed. That's one perspective of dreams. Well, Cayce said, and he's the only person that I've ever read that said this, he says that when we're asleep, we're having actual experiences. So the body and the consciousness is asleep, but the soul is active. And the soul can go anywhere. It goes way outside of three-dimensional reality. It goes to its home. It goes all over the place. And then what are called dreams are just the downloads in three-dimensional reality as best it can be downloaded into. So that's why dreams are not words, because they're happening way beyond words. The closest thing that can download them, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. That's why they communicate through pictures, because it's coming. A picture has much more facets than words can have. So I remember I had a dream one time of being in the middle of the ocean, and I was just floating in the middle of the ocean. It was nighttime, and I was in such bliss. And I woke up and thought about it. I said, if I'm floating in the middle of the ocean, I'm going to be kind of freaked out. I'm going to be in bliss. And I was thinking that I must have had, outside of the body, a feeling of oneness, being one with everything. And then it must have downloaded as me in the ocean. The ocean is like a symbol of spirituality or emotion and just kind of being interconnected with all things. So that's a little bit of a perspective that he had about dreams.
Incredible. Now, Donna, who is listening to the show, asked if a psychic would be able to connect with Edgar Cayce. I guess basically, is it possible? I guess it is, right?
Well, he did give a reading that he said that after he crossed over, he would stay connected with those he cared about and those that cared about him, and that he would continue to be a helpful influence. So I think that just like any great soul, that if anybody wants to connect to him and is seeking his influence and his guidance, that he would come to them.
Oh, fascinating. So then it would be possible, for me, I don't know. I guess I don't have the patience for psychic type things. I mean, it has to come to me. If I try, I don't know. So either I freak myself out or it just doesn't work. Now, one last thing, and then I'll give you the floor to get out any information you like.
Okay.
Spiritual growth, meditation, prayer. What did Edgar Cayce say the importance of these things were?
Well, it's basically his whole, essentially Edgar Cayce was about kind of how to, if you want to know like the purpose and meaning of life, he basically says is that you're an eternal spiritual being. You're a child of God, and remember that. Don't get lost in this little physical body and think of like, oh, woe is me, I'm nothing, I'll never amount to much. He says, what are you talking about? He says, how could you possibly have forgotten, you're like a prince and a princess, you're an heir to the Most High. And he says, take some time to wake up to that. And that's where he said, meditation, he says we have these spiritual centers, which we call chakras. And he says in meditation, those begin to spin. And then you start to get in touch. You get to start to tap into that part of you that's infinite and eternal, and do that for a while, not just a day or two. He says, try it for 3 months, and then you'll begin to, you'll start to lose that sense of, poor little old me, and you'll start to move into this consciousness of your deeper self, your eternal self. And then he says you'll start to awaken to, more peace will come into your life. Because basically you're awakening the eternal part of you. And if you know you're eternal, that's going to get rid of a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. You're not going to worry as much as if you're just thinking that you're just this little finite being. So that's where he put the importance of prayer. And prayer as a way of kind of assisting others. That prayer is like sending a psychic kind of gift, an energetic gift to whoever you're praying for. And basically, the more you meditate, the more power your prayers have to be of assistance to others.
Fantastic, absolutely fantastic. I'll tell you, I could go on for hours and hours. Well, we kind of almost did, but I could go
yeah, I've loved it. It's been fun.
Absolutely, and I mean it. I'd love for you to keep me on your contact list, and you know, things come up and you want to come back on and talk about some other events and what have you. I'd love to have you.
Yeah. You know, I teach the A.R.E's course in hypnotherapy and past life regression, and I'd love to come on and just talk about, you know, kind of what happens with hypnosis. You know, Edgar Cayce, he gave his readings under hypnotic trance, and I've learned to put people under trance, and they can kind of give their own readings. And I've had all kinds of, you know, mystical, incredible experience. You know, not people like Edgar Cayce. You know, Edgar Cayce would get a reading for somebody else, but people were able to get readings for themselves, like get in touch with all their own past lives and get in touch with their spirit guides and get all this information about, you know, stuff that's personal to them, you know, who the relationships are in their lives, kind of what they're struggling with, what their gifts are, what they need to move towards. So I'd love to come on and just share that and spark interest in people learning more about the A.R.E. and possibly coming to that course in October.
Well, that would be great, and I've got listeners already saying that this guest must come back soon. So,
thank you. If they want to learn more, just the website's www.edgarcayce.org, and if you want to learn about me and where I'm at, just do / Peter Woodbury, my name, and it'll every place I'm at for most of this year will pop up.
All right, great. And what I'd like to do is still give you the floor of anything that you'd like to get out there, any events you got coming up, websites, anything you want to get out there. You've got time. By all means, go right ahead. And I'm going to keep you linked up on latenightinthemidlands.com on our links page. And I have absolutely tremendously enjoyed this conversation tonight. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Me too. And I have a fledgling personal website, which is peterwoodbury.wordpress.com. And my name is Peter and Wood, and then B-U-R-Y, peterwoodbury.wordpress.com. And you can learn. I have a blog I've started doing and some interviews, and I'll put this one on there, and all the activities that I do with the Edgar Cayce Center.
All right, great. And I'll send you a link after. We're moving from the outlet we're on now. We're going to be heading to our own server, radio station type deal. And so I'm going to be putting it on my website. And as soon as I do, this weekend, I'll make sure I get you the link to this show. And you could do what you please.
Oh, that sounds great, Michael. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and your enthusiasm is infectious, and I see why you have such a big following.
Well, I appreciate that, and again, I thank you so much, and I will be in touch. I look forward to having you back very soon. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'd be honored. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I just love talking about Edgar Cayce, and I can see that you do too.
Oh, absolutely. All right. Well, Peter, thank you again, and we'll talk soon.
All right. Have a good night.
All right. You too, my friend. Good night. All right, everybody. That was Peter Woodbury, and on a book, I guess, put it under his pillow or something, and that he would be able to memorize it. Yes,
that happened when his father, he was never a very good student, and so he had problems with spelling, and so his father was working with him on spelling, and it was getting late, and his father was getting angrier with him, and so he asked his dad if he could just rest a bit because he was tired, and he fell asleep on the book, and when he woke up, he had a photographic recollection of every page, every word. And then his father, who was quite a character, would always brag about anything he could. And so this got around, and a state senator actually, he talked to a senator, and Edgar Cayce, a boy of about 9, slept on the senator's speech and delivered the whole speech to the senator and the staff, and that made the newspaper. So that's a verified story.
Yeah, now that's fascinating. Now the legend has it, as I was actually reading up today, and what I seen on your site was that he was able to see and speak with his late grandfather spirit, is what it said there, and that he often played with imaginary friends who he would explain to be spirits from the other side. Now, now how young was he when this began? I mean, this was as a child?
Well, the first like documented case of him actually knowing that somebody was deceased was with his grandfather. He was very close to his grandfather, and his grandfather died in a horseback riding accident. And in Kentucky, when a man dies, all the males of the family are present as they prepare the body for burial. So little Edgar was there. He knew that he had seen his grandfather prepared for death and buried. But then a few days later, he saw his grandfather out behind the barn. So he knew that this was unusual, that this was somebody who he had seen dead and buried. And then he saw him, and then he went to tell his mother, and she just told him, she said, "Oh, you must have second sight." So she didn't demonize it. She didn't, tell him it was to stop doing that. And so for the rest of his life, he had really a ministry with people on the other side. He talked a lot about, how birth into this world is parallel to what we experience at death. It's like you transition into this dimension. Next step was this organization, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, which has been around since 1931.
Oh, fantastic. So now, and he was born in Kentucky, and his psychic abilities would begin and appear when? I mean, I guess let's just start out with Edgar Cayce a bit here, and let's learn about who he was and when all this started to occur for him. And I mean,
well, he was psychically gifted his whole life. So as a child, he talked about how when he would go on walks as a kid, he could see all the nature spirits, and I guess they call them the elementals, and I guess that's what leprechauns are from, traditionally. But he could see all these basically sprites and elves and nature spirits. And then he also had contact with kind of angelic beings, or the angelic realm, and he could communicate with, he said the trees used to greet him as a child. And then as he got older, he started noticing he could see people that other people couldn't see. So he saw like what he later called discarnates. And then he was always very telepathic. He could pick up people's thoughts. And he could also see the color patterns around people, which are now called the aura. So these are all he lived in a very kind of alternative world, which was hard for him as growing up, because, he's just in rural Kentucky, and his nickname was the Freak, just because he was always talking to, it looked like he was talking to himself, and when asked, he would describe these people that nobody else could see. So a little bit rough on him. And then when he was a teenager, he moved to, he left Hopkinsville, where he was living. He moved to the next largest town, Bowling Green, and he got a job at a bookstore, and he had developed the ability to sleep on a book and retain the photographic memory of its contents. And so he slept on the catalog of the bookstore, and when he interviewed, he knew all the books they carried, and then he later knew where all the books were stocked. He said, before computers, that was quite a skill to have. And eventually lost his voice, and that became the start of the next chapter of his life.
I see. So, I was going to ask about that, his ability to sleep on...
leave his body and stay connected with a silver cord that connected just below his navel. And he said that, he says we all do that every night when we sleep, where our soul leaves our body, and we have kind of different dimensions of consciousness that we have experiences in. And so he said that, just remind me your question again.
Well, I was wondering if what he had to say about death, as far as like when we might leave the body. As when we're in the hospital and we're looking at, say, mom or dad, and they're in that bed in agony for a few days or out of it. Is that soul still in that body? I guess would be a big question.
I remember where I was going with that. He talked about in a previous life that he had been mortally wounded in a battle, and it took him 3 days to die, and he said that's when he learned how to leave his body, that it was basically the pain taught him basically how to disconnect from the pain and rise out of the body and then wait for the physical death, and then the silver cord was cut, and then he crossed over. But since he had learned to do that in that life, that helped him leave the body when he was Edgar Cayce. So it certainly would lie to reason that if we're in pain, that we could certainly leave the body while we're still alive, but the soul has separated, or not quite in the body, not quite feeling pain the way we might.
Right. So basically, the machines are keeping the body alive, not the soul, because the soul has, if you want to leave, you could probably leave.
Yes, you can learn how to separate from the body consciously. He says we all do it unconsciously when we sleep, but some people learn how to disconnect from the body in consciousness, and certainly pain becomes a motivator to do that. Because in psychology they just talk about like dissociation, where somebody's going through a traumatic experience, they learn how to leave the body, and so they kind of observe it from another place, like it's happening to something they're watching from a distance. You hear that with trauma survivors, that sometimes they have learned how to dissociate.
Yeah, well, I know in my own case, years ago, I almost drowned in the lake. I mean, I got to a point where I knew I wasn't going to make it to shore, and I knew I wasn't going to last. And you get to a point where
Hello, Stuart Mary.
Hi, Peter. This is Michael Vera with Late Night in the Midlands. How are you tonight?
Good. How are you?
I am doing just fine, and I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Well, hey, we're live, and I thought maybe we could start out a little bit with your background and how you got involved and interested in all this.
Well, Edgar Cayce talks about how you pick your parents, and so if I indeed pick my parents, my parents were, they both were interested in metaphysics, and it was largely my great-grandmother, my mother's grandmother. She lived to be 107, and so she was about 100 when I was born, and she was a medium, and so I remember going to visit, and I'd go to sit down, and she'd say, "Oh, Peter, your Uncle Herman is sitting there," and I couldn't see anybody. And I just got curious about, what she could see that I couldn't see, and whether, she was the first adult I ever met that had imaginary friends, or I didn't know what exactly. So that created an interest in metaphysics, and I just read everything I could until I got to college. I learned about Edgar Cayce and eventually pursued it further later in my life, where I read There Is a River, his biography, and made my way to the Cayce Center of A.R.E. Here in Virginia Beach.
And
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and this foundation, this was actually founded by Edgar Cayce himself.
Yes. He had a hospital here from 1928 to 1930, and then a year later he founded the Association for Research and Enlightenment.
That's fantastic. He was, I don't have to tell you, but I mean, what an incredible human being he was, and I'm looking forward to learning more about him. You can never know enough, and this is something that never gets old as far as topic goes. So he built the center. What was it? 1931 that he put it together.
Well, he moved here to Virginia Beach in the mid-20s, and then he opened a hospital from 1928 to 1930. And then when the hospital closed, and then he said that just like with birth, most births are uncomplicated, and maybe 1 out of 1,000, requires medical intervention or something like that. He said death is the same way. He says that most death is simple, but he said sometimes it's more complicated. And he and folks on the other side would help people that were having a difficult time transitioning.
I see. So then, that's interesting. So because that's what I've often thought is that, when we die, maybe we're actually really being born and and then when we're born, maybe we're actually really dying somewhere else. Yeah. So that's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. And then he he gave a lot of talks. He was a public person. And he said sometimes these discarnates would come to his talks. Like if you ever give a talk and you notice lots of empty seats, there may be discarnates, that are not, souls that aren't in a body. And he said sometimes they would even raise their hands, like ask a question. And so he would every now and then entertain a question from a discarnate that was in the audience.
That's incredible. I had a friend who had recently passed away here, and she was a psychic. And I wonder now that if a psychic like Edgar Cayce, for instance, goes to the other side, is he now helping people on the other side connect with us on this side?
You mean, is he kind of like a medium, helping?
Yeah, exactly. Like, would he be helping people on the other side now connect with like you and I, say, on this side?
I mean, that's possible. I haven't heard of that, but that's. He was certainly, on this side, he was helping people make the transition. So kind of what his role on the other side is, I'm not, wouldn't be sure.
So what did Edgar Cayce, where was his position on death? I mean, we'll go to the hospital and we'll visit people and they're on their deathbed. And it seems like they're in agony for a few days. Well, did he ever discuss that? Like, does the spirit leave the body before any of that, or how does all that happen? Do you know?
Well, talking just about Edgar Cayce's perspective, he didn't go into whether when exactly the soul leaves the body. I mean, one of the reasons he said that he had learned how to give readings, basically when he would give a reading, his soul or whatever, would